Hi there, and welcome to this video. Today happens to be January 28th, 2026, and in quite a cold streak here in New Jersey. Over the next few days, the temperatures in the early morning are below 10 degrees. Actually supposed to be exactly zero in a few days. But it's warm in here. Okay, and please excuse the background. If it looks a bit like a playground, that's because for my grandson, that's what it is. You can see the dinosaur tent, among other things, mostly about dinosaurs. Anyway, I want to share with you some very interesting, relevant, um, and I think enlightening and inspiring um, perspectives, recognitions of things, um, understandings of what makes us how we are. And the point of that is to spot these things, recognize these things for what they are, these things that take away from being all that we can be, being fluid and present, and needing to hold on to things that deter from being happy and successful and living a happy and successful life. So the main subjects I want to talk about, and I've spoken about these before more than once, are what we can call, to sum it up, self-instilled defensive reactions that become damaging misdirections. One that I've been speaking about for roughly a dozen years, I have called stubbornly held protective attitude, or resolutely held protective attitude. Could also be called a poorly reasoned programmed reaction. And the other cousin to this is what we've called a command. It could also be called a panicked, demanding insistence. Both of these are self-instilled programming that are intended to protect us because we're so fearful of experiencing that we set something, a programmed reaction that's supposed to protect us, but it only traps us in the fear and in the overreacting. I noticed a long time ago that in the circumstance of any type of therapy or processing, you can commonly have a situation where you, quote unquote, process something fully, like it's gone, and then almost immediately it's there again. It's back. And this doesn't mean that the processing wasn't successful. It wasn't fully successful because there's something underlying that particular undesirable feeling that was processed, something that demands that it remain. And that can be either one of these self-instilled defensive reactions. It can be the resolutely held protective attitude or the command. Either one of these insists, demands, that one hold on to being a certain way in relation to something that the person is afraid of. Let's take some examples. Let's take an example. See, the primal fear, as I've mentioned many times, the primal fear is feeling of being rejected, abandoned, unaccepted, unloved, being pushed out of and not allowed in the togetherness, the usness of everyone else, or of a specific group. But essentially, it's the primal fear is just that. It's the fear of being left out of the togetherness and the usness of everybody else. And this is why humiliation, embarrassment, is such a terribly intense fear and feeling, because in such a circumstance, what the person takes from that is the ultimate expression of not being accepted, of being judged as unworthy to be included, to be ridiculed. That's why that is such a thing that makes a person cringe and will go to great lengths to avoid, and can barely allow themselves to even think about any time where they've experienced that. The primal fear of being rejected and abandoned, being left out of the us because nobody wants you. That's it. And we all deal with that feeling. As I've said many times before, I feel, or I recognize, that that seems to come from that shock of transition from the purely spiritual. And in a purely spiritual, distance is a projection, it's an illusion. There's no separation or distance. There is no there, there's only here. There's no them, it's all us. And it's just a wonderfully comfortable existence and recognition of life, in comparison to feeling like you've got to protect yourself from the terrible pain of unacceptance and rejection. And that in mind, the examples I will give now of self-instilled defensive reactions, which are damaging misdirections. Let's take that very fear. First, a self-installed programming that would be a resolutely held protective attitude. That could be something like, if I let them know me, they'll reject me. And that attitude would demand that a person not be very open to others about who they are or their feelings or their life or their experience. The fear of that it would make them seem unworthy or unacceptable. Again, if I let them know me, they'll reject me. Now, what we call the other version of self-instilled defensive reaction, which we call command, or could be called a panicked, demanding insistence, would take that same fear, only more intensely, and it would be expressed as something like this. It would be like, stay away. It would just be like, stay away, or run. It would be something like that. See the difference between a resolutely held protective attitude and a command, which is a panicked, demanding insistence. A poorly reasoned, programmed reaction, which is a resolutely held protective attitude, contains a superficial and poorly thought out, untrue reasoning. The reasoning part of that is, if I let them know me, then they'll reject me. See, there's a reasoning going on there. It's poor reasoning, but the phrase that's being acted on there is expressed in words, is something like, if I let them know me, they'll reject me. And it demands that the individual, having instilled that attitude within themselves, like I said, hide themselves, hide their feelings, their interests, anything and everything that would make them feel vulnerable to being rejected. Whereas the command, or panicked, demanding insistence, is so shrill and so intense that it's like, damn the torpedoes. There's no time to import any reasoning into this. Just stay away, go away. It doesn't contain the if this, then that. It doesn't contain the reasoning element. And that's what makes these distinct from each other. Resolutely held protective attitude contains an if this, then that. It contains a rudimentary, frankly wrong, but nevertheless a form of reasoning of why I have to be this way about this, why you have to be this way about this. Whereas the command just says, do this, don't allow that. A command could also be, you're bad. It could be anything that insists on something so strongly. Think of it this way. It's like, If a child is told by a parent um, they have to do something a certain way, if the parent says, well, because if you do, this is why that will work if you do this, that's kind of like a resolutely held protective attitude. And there's a reasoning being given there. And if the parent says, because I said so, that's more like a command. Because I said so, just do it. There's a force, there's a shrillness to that. And that's what makes them different. And each of these things, either one of these self-instilled defensive reactions, can be the chain that binds you to a self-limiting and self-hurting persona that obscures your true sense and full expression of self. You know, the true expression and sense of self is to be fully present. It's to be able to have an experience and be there comfortably, you know, comfortable in your own skin, so to speak. Okay, and that is always the best way to be and the most successful way to be. But where fear rules, we will instill a programming, a self-instilled defensive reaction. Sometimes it's the resolutely held protective attitude. Sometimes it's the command. And again, these things bind us to being a false me, a false self. And that's why there can be, as I've discovered, there are a variety of techniques intended to unravel our false personalities, our personas. There are many words you can use for these identities, but whatever you refer to them by, they're a facade. They're a false representation of self. Okay, they're a substitute presence for your own natural presence, which is not so limited in reaction, in emotion, in representation to a defined way of being. We are naturally present, we're naturally fluid, able to experience anything, relate to it as it is, without fear. That is full presence, okay? But when we're in some false personality, some persona, some false self, they can be very, very difficult with the best of techniques to resolve. Sometimes they seem resolved, but they're really not. But what really anchors these in place, and this is something I've only come to realize in the past 2 or 3 years. Until I realized this, it was a lot more work to help a person unravel and be done with any of their false personas that they've taken on. It's like we've got a closet full of suits, and these are the different ways of being we take on. And since I've recognized these in the past 2 or 3 years, it happened during, I think, one particular session with a client that it really stood out for me as we were running one step of the technique to resolve and remove a false persona. I noticed that there seemed to be a tug of war going on where this person would release more and more from that identity. They'd feel a distance from it, and then they'd feel it coming back in and closing in again. And I could perceive that something in them was holding on to this, was fighting it. And it wasn't hard for me to realize. I'm very empathic and telepathic in my work with each individual, and I just felt the presence of some attitude. And just instinctively, intuitively, I used the question that I use to bring these out so that we can process and unravel these, which is there some thought, idea, or attitude you have? In this case, the other part of the full question, is there some thought, idea, or attitude you have which says that you don't dare let go of this self, of this identity, that you must hold on to it? And then, having asked that question, they just about immediately spit out, yeah, if I'm without this, whatever it was in that particular session, I'm not going to go into that own individual's specific content, okay? But then very quickly, that resolved using the technique that I use to resolve resolutely held protective attitudes, which is magical in its effect. And then that person was perfectly comfortable letting go of the attitude that said they must hold on to the identity, and that it was very simple and easy to complete the dissolution, the dissolving, fully absorbing, digesting, processing away of the identity. And that is a wonderful, beautiful feeling, to be out from under that shell. It's something we all desire, to feel the way we should feel and be able to be free of programmed, limiting, damaging ways of being that we feel trapped in. And just as the resolutely held protective attitude, which again could also be called poorly reasoned programmed reaction, the other form of self-instilled defensive reaction that acts this way being the command. Okay, the command, like I said, it is different. It's just a demanding insistence that doesn't include reasoning in its expression, like stay away, you're bad, whatever it may be. But it's something very, very simple like that. But it's more forceful. It substitutes force for reason. Again, it's like a parent saying, because I said so. The situation is so demanding that just do it this way, just be this way, just avoid that, resist this, whatever it may be. It doesn't allow to even have the component of this is why, this is why. It doesn't even have the this is why. The this is why is simply it's got to be this way or else. That's all there is to it, to a command, or what could be called a panicked, demanding insistence. And the technique for resolving a command is different than the technique for processing away a resolutely held protective attitude. Just to run it down very quickly, with a resolutely held protective attitude, you identify what feeling of fear is infused into that attitude, and we do my technique of spiritual digestion. Allow the full expression of that feeling to be felt. Fully have how it feels. Rather than resisting it, it digests relatively quickly. And that's the first step. The next step is to ask, what is that particular attitude intended to protect you from feeling or having to experience? And then having pointed that out and recognized that, I have the client have passed through your mind the moments, times, and places where this exact scenario or circumstance of being threatened with this was present for you, or felt like it was present or threatening. And just have those various moments pass through your mind. In doing that, a lot of the energy or feeling of this gets processed well enough that after that is done, we can go into re-evaluating that idea, that reasoning, by asking, what have the consequences been of maintaining that attitude? And again, we can use as an example, if I let them know me, they'll reject me. Let's use that as, let's say that's what the client has been expressing. What have the consequences been of maintaining that attitude? And the person can now take a look at how damaging and limiting the attitude has been. In this case, the client would likely recognize, if they've been using, if I let them know me, they'll reject me, they'll be recognizing that they've never allowed themselves, it doesn't allow for intimacy. There's been such a fear of rejection that intimacy is not allowed. So it's been we all need intimacy. We all need that love and connection. So that would be a major consequence that would come up. A number of other things revolving around that kind of thing. Always being uncomfortable around people when there's a feeling like you could get to know each other. Consequences could be missing out on a lot of experiences because you don't dare get that involved with someone, and so on and so on. And basically we'd capture anything and everything that arises as a consequence, that has been a consequence of this. And having looked at that objectively, because before that we successfully processed the fear that held it in place. Then I can ask you the question, how does maintaining that attitude seem to you now? And the answer will typically be, it's silly, it's harmful, there's no good in that, it doesn't accomplish anything good. And we'll make sure I'll check, can you now be done with that attitude? Sometimes there's an underlying attitude of the same nature that holds that attitude in place. And we'd go through those steps again. Once or twice that can happen. But anyway, that essentially is how we address the self-instilled defensive reaction that we're calling a resolutely held protective attitude, or poorly reasoned programmed reaction. Now, going back to the other manifestation, the other self-instilled defensive reaction, a panicked, demanding insistence, i.e., a command. The way this processes is I have you express the phrase that the command is expressing through in your mind right now. And I tell you, express that, express the feeling of that in the words, exactly as it is, with the feeling and intention of that. And most people will do this non-verbally. Some people feel it works better for them to do it out loud. Either way. And then in the next moment, see, the command will change. So, okay, and then in the next moment, after having done that, now express it exactly as it is manifesting now. The words can change, the feeling can be less, the intention can be a little more clarified, but express it in every quality as it is now manifesting within you in this moment. And then again, exactly as it is now expressing in words, content, feeling, strength, everything. And usually in a minute or two or three, that'll be enough. And that command is simply gone. It's no longer present. And that's how that works. Now, it's important to understand about these, that, that the wording of these can be objectively grammatically incorrect, syntax incorrect, or not even really convey the idea or thought behind it in a sentence put on a piece of paper for a stranger to read. But that's irrelevant. All that matters is for you, for the client, that's how it expresses. Whatever phrase or wording resonates perfectly as it expresses for you is all that matters. It doesn't, sometimes a client needs to be told, it's okay. No, you don't need to rephrase it or reword it to make it proper English or so that somebody outside of this session would know what you mean. Completely irrelevant, okay? Language is often an inexact and or superficial means of trying to convey a feeling or idea or attitude. And so put into language, put into words, it can be hard to, in fact, synthesize the feeling or idea to some kind of universally transmittable form. And that's the truth about language. And that's why everything is really about feelings, and there's more to expression than words. There's intonations, all the ways that we try to fully flesh out a feeling or idea in trying to express it to another person. But for the context of resolving that particular self-instilled defensive reaction, if I let them, I'm using examples that are easy to understand for the sake of explaining this to you. If I let them know me, they'll reject me, But it could very well be in the person's own words, there's no use trying. It wouldn't work. And that could be the phrase. And to that person, that's their way of expressing the same thing. But obviously, if somebody just gave you those words, you would not know what they're talking about. to initiate a conversation. But again, that's not relevant at all. Whatever phrase or words, say it for the individual, for them in their own expression. That's all that matters. It's not for publication. And sometimes, once or twice, I may need to explain that to you, to a client in session, so they don't feel burdened with saying it the quote unquote correct way. No relevance to that at all. However the words arise through you, that's exactly the way it needs to be taken. To do anything else with it, to instruct or demand or insist, to reword it so that anybody reading it would have a better sense of the content, now you're altering, now you're forcing them to shoehorn their idea into different words, and that can make for problems. It can certainly make it more complicated and rougher and not as smooth and flowing. So there's really no need or point to do anything other than accept whatever way it arises within you. And anybody doing this kind of work with a client should be more than capable of easily getting what is meant. And they should be reassuring. I would be reassuring. I got it. Oh, I understand perfectly, because I really do. And that's what works best, to take it in the way that you yourself generate it. So these are the things, again, that bind us to ways of being, to not being ourselves, to actually keeping ourselves trapped in ways of being that don't allow for how we'd really like to feel and how we'd really like to experience others. It's important, for the sake of processing, for the sake of therapeutically approaching and fully resolving whatever is arising within the person, be it a resolutely held protective attitude or a command. Because if you don't match up the correct technique, recognize it for what it is, use the technique that applies, it can be a rough or unsuccessful go. And we all have countless iterations of these things, of the command and of the resolutely held protective attitude. And besides what I just have been explaining about the resolutely held protective attitude, can be recognized because it has an explanation attached to it, a sort of a logic, even though it's a faulty logic. This is why I have to be this way. And whereas a command just says, just do this. They're also very distinct from each other, because the command is just so shrill and forceful. It's usually just one or two or three words, but there's a force behind it, that an insistence, a demanding insistence. And I would be surprised if, in just watching and listening to this video, you notice one or two of these within yourself. Well, come see me. We'll easily resolve that. And you will be much happier, much more comfortable in your own skin. In fact, maybe I will give you an example of how successful it can be when we take these up. Okay, I'm going to give you an example from a session. Bear with me a moment. Today, and I'm going to read what this client's expression of how deeply they changed from processing such an attitude. I think I processed everything. There's no line of separation. I don't feel anything no energy saying you should be doing anything. You should be this way or you should be that way. That line is completely absent now. All I'm feeling is that it's gone. It's completely gone. It's not there. It's just now. It feels like I'm just now. I hit the place I wanted to go. I'm here. I made it. Every part of me is 100% awake. And I won't be stepping unconsciously into attitudes or roles. I'm fully present. This is all I've ever wanted. I'm so here. That's so cool, just to be here. I don't feel tethered to anything, any attitude, any feeling. I don't feel any binds or tethers. Those are the exact words from one of my clients from a session today, from processing just the things I've been talking about here now in this video. And it's quite what I would call spiritual liberation. It's a wonderful feeling. Now, to me, ultimately, what's most important about this work isn't just having some wonderful and magnificent feeling arise in a session from the work. For me, more than that, it's about permanent changes. And my clients do express this all the time. There are some practices, some of which I've been very familiar with, and a lot of my clients have been through, where they've had an occasional session that was really, for them, so fleetingly meaningful, where they felt this incredible feeling of change that was marvelous, and then they're just seeking to have that feeling again in another session, and seeking to have that feeling each time they have that feeling. To them, it signifies some great change, but it doesn't last most of the time, as wonderful as it is. See, in the work that I'm doing and with my clients, it's not about a moment of feeling fantastic. It's about forever being changed, a true spiritual liberation, where it's more than saying to yourself, well, I'm changed, I'm advanced spiritually because I remember what happened in that session. No, it's more like everything is different, and it's still different, and it's always different ever afterward. It's more expansive, more comfortable, feel more capable, more loving, more trusting, more loved, more trusted, more present. Okay, and to that point, I will also give you another example. And this is also, well, this session was yesterday for a client, okay? And this client had initially come to me because of difficulties in his feelings and attitudes between himself and his family. He was struggling with for years and years, and in some ways, it wasn't good. And this is what he said at the beginning of a session we did yesterday, because essentially he was telling me, this area is changed, this area is great, and he can look at other areas of his life now because this is solved, is how he put it at the beginning of this session, talking about this. Things are good. I've changed so much through these sessions about what I came to you for. And I don't want to go into specifics here, but he goes into specifics about what no longer happens between himself and his wife and his children that was bad, and how changed it is now, and how good it is, and how it's evolved through these sessions. Again, he says, I've changed so much through these sessions about exactly what I came to you for. I don't feel the need to be this way with them anymore. I don't feel there's anything else that needs fixing about this anymore. See, again, that's what it's really about. It's not about feeling something changed in the course of doing a session. It's about life ever after. That's what it's all about. And that's also why it's so important and so necessary to recognize and resolve this self-instilled programming that's intended to be defensive, but is essentially damaging misdirection. This can all change, and it does all change. And what I've been explaining to you today in this video is the mechanics behind that. So to experience this for yourself or learn more, perhaps you'd be interested, or you'd like to learn to do this for people yourself and use these techniques to enlighten and help other people, or to have sessions for yourself, you can contact me through my website, dexsessions.com. Looking forward to seeing you. And I hope you enjoyed this talk, found it inspiring, enlightening, and useful.